Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. I think we're ready to start here, Seth.
Hello? Oh, my mic's on.
Okay, so how we're going to structure this is I'm going to introduce Seth. My name's Diana Tamblyn. I'm a local cartoonist, and I've had the good fortune to know Seth for quite a long time now. Cartooning is a small group of people in Canada, for sure. So we tend to cross paths quite a number of times. So we're going to have a conversation. We're going to talk about Clyde Fans, Seth's latest book, and then we're going to go into some of his other many projects, and then we'll open it up for a few questions from the audience. Then apparently there's going to be a table set up outside that Seth can sign at, and if you have further questions, I'm happy to do that afterwards, because there's a panel here right after this ends. So we'll get right into it. So welcome, Seth.
Thank you.
Seth was born Gregory Gallant in Clinton, Ontario, and studied at the Ontario College of Art in Toronto, where he developed his pen name Seth. His signature comic series, Palookaville, features short stories and autobiographical stories, debuted from publisher Drawn Quarterly in 1991. In 1996, his graphic novel, It's a Good Life If You Don't Weaken, was published and was selected as one of the 100 best comics of the 20th century by the Comics Journal. Dominion is a fictional Ontario town where many of Seth's stories take place. It provides the backdrop for his graphic novels Wimbledon Green, the greatest comic book collector in the world, The Great Northern Brotherhood of Canadian Cartoonists, and George Sprott, which was originally serialized in the New York Times. Seth is also a celebrated illustrator and book designer. His illustrations have appeared in numerous publications, including covers for The New Yorker and The Walrus. He fully designs every issue of the magazine Canadian Notes and Queries. He has won a number of awards for his book designs, most notably the 25-book Peanuts collection by Charles Schulz from Fantagraphics Books. He is also one of the forces behind the annual Doug Wright Awards, honoring the best in Canadian comics and graphic novels. Seth's artwork has been exhibited internationally in group and solo shows, which I'll be talking in more detail later. In 2014, he was a subject of the National Film Board's full-length documentary, Seth's Dominion. Seth recently finished the major work Clyde Fans, which he's here to talk about with us today. Seth lives in Guelph, Ontario, with his wife and their 2 cats in a house named Inkwell's End. Welcome, Seth.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
It was very difficult to, he's very accomplished, so it was very difficult to get that as short as it was, believe it or not.
Very nice.
So the main reason we're here today is to discuss your latest graphic novel, Clyde Fans, which came out this spring. Clyde Fans is a story of 2 brothers, Abraham and Simon, their complex sibling relationship, and the slow decline of their fan manufacturing company. The story takes place over an approximately 50-year time period. And that's this beautiful book here, which is 488 pages and was a labor of love for over 20 years. So people might not understand that cartooning is a very laborious, long, solitary process. So what is it about the cartooning form that holds such appeal to you?
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, cartooning is really an inefficient way to tell a story because it takes a really long time to tell a story in comics, and people read it really quick. So I worked on Clyde Fans for 20 years, and then many people have said to me, I really enjoyed it. I read it yesterday. So it's like, that is like, kind of drives you crazy in a certain way because it takes, you know, a page, which you read in a few seconds sometimes, can take like a couple of days' work of really like struggling to pencil it, or write it, pencil it, ink it, color it, etc. So it is like it's not really a form that you would say like this is an efficient way to tell a story. But the funny thing about comics is that it may be one of the best ways to tell a story. I think that cartooning has always had a very low rung culturally because the form was never really used primarily for anything serious. It was always either for jokes or for kids. And both those forms, humor and children's literature, have always been pretty much looked down upon as sort of like bastard children of real literature. But the interesting thing in comics is that in my generation, and the generation just before me, the underground cartoonists of the 60s and 70s, it was like really the first time that people started to use comics for adult purposes. And I think progressively over the last 40 years or so, there's been a realization that the form is really quite sublime. You can capture quite a complicated set of intimate kind of experiences through the comics form, and I think one of the great reasons for it is comics might be the only form that can only be read in the brain. Like, as we're at a writing festival right now, many authors have stood up and read from their work. You can read a book aloud. You can't really read a comic book aloud. The minute you try, you quickly fall into this problem of like, okay, in the first panel, this guy says, and then he says, and you very quickly realize it's very awkward. And in fact, the worst is when people start to make little voices, you know. And it's like, it doesn't really operate as any other form except sitting down, looking directly at the work and reading it, and combining those words and pictures in your brain. And it's actually an extremely intimate form because of that. And I find that this may sound counterintuitive to people, but I think it may be the best way to tell a personal adult story, even more powerful than prose. But I'm sure many writers would argue with that.
Having said all that, I'm making Seth read from Clyde Fans
Yes.
later on.
Yeah, we talked about it earlier. I almost never do it. Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about the real-life inspiration of the story, Clyde Fans?
Yeah, back in the late 90s, I just finished a book called It's a Good Life If You Don't Weaken. And I was starting to, around the end of that time, I was starting to fish around for what would be my next book. And there was a storefront that I used to walk by all the time in Toronto at, I think it was at Queen and Sherbourne, and it was called Clyde Fans, and it was a fan store. And I'm pretty sure it was already out of business even then. There was a little sign in the window that said, case of emergency, call this number, and the sign was already water-stained. So I think that was, you know, I think it had been out of business for a few years. But I walked by it often, and I always looked at it because it had a very nice hand-painted sign of the words Clyde Fans on the window. And I always looked at that. I was very interested in hand lettering. And one day, though, I looked closer. I looked into the office. I put my face against the glass, and it was dark. And there was what you'd expect in such a place. It was, you know, there were some desks, some fans, some filing cabinets, a tin ceiling, and on the back wall, 2 photographs. 2 typical sort of mid-60s black and white business photographs of 2 men. Now, I would love to see those photographs again because I don't remember what they look like now. All I remember is the 2 brothers I made up based on those faces in my mind, because basically all that happened was I saw those faces and I thought, who were these people and what were their lives? And then over the next year or so, as I was finishing up that other book, I sort of thought about that, and I went through a few variations of ideas. I had a very surreal story at one point at the beginning with animal people. It was like it's like nothing like it eventually ended up. But at some point I figured out what the story would be. And I started Clyde Fans figuring that the book before it took about 3 years. So I figured Clyde Fans would be a little longer and it would take about 5 years. But it was a project that took on a life of its own. And it went on.
Now, Clyde Fans is broken up into 5 sections, and the sections go back and forth between the 2 brothers, Abraham and Simon, who was inspired by these 2 photographs Seth described. And Abraham and Simon have 2 very different personality types. So Abraham is the older brother who's carried on the family business from his father, although Simon does help with accounting and marketing, while Simon is introverted, quiet, and risk-averse. So you've said that both brothers represent 2 sides of your personality. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, people expect that I am a very melancholy, shy person because of the kind of work I do. So every time I've had an interview with somebody, they always say at some point, they usually say like, oh, you're really like not a shy person, you're not quiet. And it's true, I talk a lot. And I'm not an introvert. I mean, but my work, I think often the work is a reflection of the part of them that you don't often see. So I think the quieter part of my work is the quieter part of me. But with the two brothers, I mean, very early on, it's like the most obvious thing that writers do. I mean, every character is yourself to some degree. So both these brothers are certainly me. There's the extroverted brother and the introverted brother, and I mean, that's pretty straightforward. In real life, I'm a very extroverted social person, but I spend most of my life in my studio alone. It's a very solitary existence being a cartoonist, and that is the part of my life that I'm most comfortable with. Even though I am a very talkative, outgoing person, I value introversion more than I value extroversion. I don't usually like extroverts very much. All my friends are quiet. That might be because I'm doing all the talking. But it was very easy for me to make that decision about the two brothers, and I knew quickly that I would want them to be two different types, and I wanted to build a story that explored their lives individually for quite a while until I brought them together. And that was kind of one of the whole reasons of the way I structured Clyde Fans was that I thought to myself, like, to backtrack a touch, the comics of the late 80s, or the mid to late 80s, a lot of it had to do with trying to produce work that wasn't fantasy-based, because so much of the history of comics is about fantasy. So many of the cartoonists of my generation, they turned naturally to real life or autobiography. So I'd done my autobiographical stuff, I'd done my fake autobiographical stuff, then I was like, I'm going to go into straight fiction. And I thought to myself, like, this was also a point where I thought, I want to try to use the form differently than I've been using it. And so much of Clyde Fans is an experiment on how to tell a very small story. I wanted it to be as far away from like the bombast of comics. So really, if you try to describe what the story of Clyde Fans is, there's really not hardly a story at all. It's just two brothers and who they are. I wanted to scale it down, and as I worked on the book, I even realized I was even less interested in the plot that I'd come up with than I even planned, because all the plot really boils down to is an uncomfortable conversation later in the book. And I realized that as I worked on the book, I became less and less interested in the idea that a story is made up of conflict. I don't think that's a requirement. That's one of the first things they teach you about writing a story is where's the conflict. But I don't think you need conflict to write a story. A lot of work is about, a lot of what I'm attracted to is atmosphere. And Clyde Fans, a lot of it is about the world they live inside, imaginary or real.
I was listening to an interview with you from when you spoke at the Strand bookstore in New York City. And I think you were saying there that you feel like now this story has too much conflict in it, and that your new work, you want to have as little conflict as possible.
Everything I watch or read and I like it, at the end I always say to myself, that was really great, but I wish it had a little less conflict in it. I like a story where, it's funny because I think most fiction is built around the idea of people in conflict. And it's interesting that I don't really think that it's a requirement.
I think one of the things that you do best actually is your quiet scenes. And I have an animation background, and they taught us that you should think very carefully where you have the silent moments, because they can be as powerful as the big bombastic moments.
Oh, absolutely. Comics, it's interesting. One of the great things about this era of being a cartoonist is you can use quiet. And this is like, it sounds straightforward, but in the history of comics, there's practically never been a silent panel, because you weren't allowed to use silent panels in commercial cartooning for the most part, because it was economical. You'd say, like, here's a story, you have 8 pages to tell this story. In 8 pages, you did not have a lot of time to slow down. So in panel 1, Superboy is in his bedroom. In panel 2, Superboy is on the moon. It's like you don't have any time to slow things down. But once the form started to being used by artists, you could literally say, I can have 5 pages of silence. The character can walk slowly from one place to another, or you can choose a panel to just punctuate a scene, say, let's have a pause here. And that's the most obvious thing you would use in film, or maybe it's hard to have silence in a prose novel, but you can certainly describe a silent sequence. In comics, I'd say there wasn't much quiet.
Now here, just so the audience knows, Simon is the one here on the left, and Abraham is the one on the right. So even visually, you can tell that they're both fairly distinct.
Yeah, that's pretty much a rule in cartooning.
Yeah.
Don't draw all the characters to look the same.
Yeah. So Abraham, who's the outgoing brother, as we mentioned, he's the one who leaves the family home, goes out into the world, gets married, has affairs, supports the whole family, is outgoing and gregarious. But he only gets 2 of the 5 chapters of Clyde Fans, and maybe not surprisingly, those chapters are more dialogue heavy. Well, Simon, the shy introverted one, gets 3 chapters, and these tend to have more silent pages and panels with less dialogue and more narrative. So we've talked a bit about the pacing and storytelling, but was that something you did consciously with the 2 brothers?
Yeah, it was really conscious. I mean, everything in the book was really carefully considered. I mean, within reason. The interesting thing about cartooning is also that you can make a lot of planning, but in some ways, when you sit down and do the work, the real work happens spontaneously on the page. And that's an integral part of comics that's hard to explain, is that a lot of times people who don't really know comics, when they're saying how you should do them, they suggest you write a script, like a screenplay, and then you sit down and you draw that script, and that is not how you make good comics. The way you make good comics is you figure things out, you know what's going on, you might even write down the dialogue, but the actual process of drawing it is the process of writing it. So everything you do on the page happens to some degree through spontaneity, and connections are made between the images as you draw them, and sort of there's something going on in the back of the brain that allows it. So you can't really plan everything, but you can make sort of grand decisions in the beginning. And much of Clyde Fans was planned so that there would be different approaches to how each of the sections operated. So the first section of the book is a very long monologue by Abraham. Now, these men are salesmen, or at least Abraham is a salesman. And so it makes perfect sense that Abe would be doing more talking than Simon. And initially, when I did this, I knew I wanted to have a monologue, but I wasn't really too sure how I was going to do it. In comics, there's a tradition of the thought balloon, but I never liked the thought balloon. I always thought it was an awkward and weird design choice. A balloon and little bubbles coming down. I always thought that's not well designed, and we don't really hear people's thoughts. It always struck me as like if I was going for realism, thought balloons were a cheat. So then I thought, well, maybe I could use narration blocks over top, which is another traditional comics approach. But when you use narration, it creates a distance between the figure and the blocks. So I deliberately chose to have him speaking directly, even though there's no one there for him to be speaking to. I've told this many times, but I wasn't sure what to do. And I was reading an old comic book from the 50s, a little Lulu comic book. And in it, Lulu and Tubby are doing something, and Tubby is running along by himself, and he's talking, and he's saying to himself something like, I got to get home before Lulu gets there. I got to beat her, or something like that. And I thought to myself, who is Tubby talking to? He's not talking to anyone. He's talking to himself, and it works. It's perfectly normal. So I thought, I will just use that technique with Abe. And so in the first section, Abe is talking for 70 or 80 pages directly as a narrator. But because I'm using word balloons, that means it's an outside form of communication. Later in the book, in the third section, it's Simon's turn to talk, and it's all narration blocks. And I chose that for the exact opposite reason, because I knew that that would turn into an interior monologue. And there's a big difference between an exterior monologue and an interior monologue. And the same in chapter 2, everything is in what I call naturalistic style, which is you follow the character around and watch and listen, like in a film. And that way, there's nothing interior. That's all like from the outside, but all interpretation, which is very different than talking to you. And then in the fourth chapter, I finally have what the approach is conversation. They finally start to speak to each other. And then the fifth chapter is something different.
And here's from the first chapter with Abe. He's kind of talking to himself or in and around his apartment, which I think he's a lonely character at this point. And it makes sense that he's talking to himself. And then this is Simon with this kind of no dialogue, introspective part.
Yeah, in the first chapter, I wanted Abraham to be someone you would feel something for, so that later, if he becomes a little more complicated, you don't start off disliking him.
Now, Abraham is one of the main Clyde Fans salesmen.
Mm-hmm.
He takes sales very seriously, I would say. He tries to learn as much as he can about it, possibly because he admits he can never be the best salesman because he doesn't really like people.
Mm-hmm.
Throughout the book, he repeats sales mantras and quizzes to himself, almost as a relaxation technique.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about these mantras and sales tips? Like, I was wondering if you had to do research.
Yeah, well, I knew at the beginning that I was going to write about sales, and it's funny, at the end of the book, it occurred to me, I thought, has anybody ever written a book about sales that was positive? Like salesmen, they're always terrible stories, and it's like at the end, it's like sales is always presented negatively. Besides books teaching you how to sell, those books are positive. And that's literally how I learned about sales. I have no experience in sales, and all I knew about sales was Death of a Salesman. So I went out and I got a bunch of books from like the Goodwill, on how to sell that were all produced in the 50s and 60s. And they were very easy to find. I think I bought 20 books like immediately because I think that was like a very big market of book sales in that era. How to Sell, 7 Effective Tips to Selling, blah, blah, blah. They were all kind of the same. And they all basically taught you the techniques to use to manipulate people into buying things. Mm-hmm. And those were very helpful. But the real book that was helpful was a book I bought that was called something like, I think it was called something like The 40 Greatest Sales Ever Made. And they were first-person stories from salesmen from the 40s and 30s and 50s. And these were great. These were really, really readable. And I think I still have that book, and I've read it a couple of times. Because they were great stories that taught me the other side, the harder part, not just the gung-ho stuff. This was like, what it was really like to be a salesman. But they were also, every story was bragging. Because every story was, I won. This was my great sale. And that really gave me the basic information to start on the character of Abe.
So at one point in the book, Simon, the shy brother, goes on a sales trip by himself, which seems like a really brave thing for him to do.
Yes.
It seems like he mostly stays inside, but he's taken it upon himself that he's going to do a sales trip by himself and take himself out of his comfort zone. His brother Abe is very negative about the whole thing, kind of tries to discourage and dissuade him from going, but he goes anyway. The sales trip, I don't think I'm revealing anything to say it was not a success. But the journey he makes, he does this few-day trip to do sales in the city of Dominion. And it seems to be a trip that's a big marker in his life and that he revisits many times over. So can you talk about that?
Well, I knew Simon had to have some event in his life. He could have stayed. He's a character in Retreat. He's like the building they live in is probably as much a character as the two brothers. And Simon's life is determined by that space. But I did feel like I wanted him to make one effort in life that he would be like trapped in those particular moments, because he has such a small life that it's an important element of the character that like everyone else in the world has moved on in life in some way, and he's still in this space and time from like 25, 30 years ago. Everything that happened to him is important and significant and iconic, but like this isn't what most people's lives are like, because most people pile up more experience over time. Simon also has a transcendental kind of experience at this point that changes who he is, that is like a central point in what the story is about. This was one of the complicated parts of working on this book for so long, as I serialized it slowly. And I knew what the book was about, obviously, but the readers, by reading individual sections, never really knew where the book was going. And I knew that this last chapter is like the key element that makes everything make sense, and also that changes what the book is about. The book feels like it's about real life, and about sort of mundane existence. But the final chapter sort of changes it into something that's a bit more about the unreality of life. And so I was always anxious to get to that point, to like put the key in that explains what the book is about.
So talking about that last section of the book, which that's what this piece is from here, where we go back in time to Simon's trip to Dominion, it's very dreamlike. And to me, when I read this, I thought the storytelling and artistry are sophisticated and inspired. And it honestly knocked me right out. I've had to read it a number of times over. I think it's one of the best examples of the graphic novel format that I've ever read. And in particular, I think the writing is exquisite. And so this is, I'm going to have Seth read a passage, even though he's not really for that. But I wanted people think of graphic novels as being very visual, and of course they are, and often the art is what gets all the attention, but the writing in this part is so strong that I wanted people to hear some of it and appreciate it.
Well, I don't usually do this because, for one thing, like I said, it's very difficult to read from comics. They really don't work, and it is strange to remove the words from the pictures, to be honest. And the only reason I agreed is because I felt guilty, but also because this is just narration. So it's not characters talking to each other, and the narration, I think, can probably be read without the pictures to some degree. I think it's hard to separate the words from the pictures in comics, but I'm going to read this section just because it'll make Diana happy. So I will just give it a quick setup, and that Simon is sitting underneath a tree where he is about to have, I would say, well, it could be an out-of-body experience, it could be a hallucination, it could be many things. It's not determined for facts what's going on here. It could be a mystical experience. So anyhow, here we go. And in that moment, that almost imperceptible moment when evening becomes night, I went out and up, into that darkening night sky, like in a dream, but not a dream, up to a ceiling of clouds, through and beyond, coming to rest just below a dome of swimming stars. Yet here, in this austere crystal cave, the bottle began to empty, slowly. I faded some, started to thin out, so calmly, without feeling, I turned back, down again, into that solid world of things and places. Down and onward. Now quick, down a lane and over a ditch. Across a field, there, an old shed, long abandoned. Its walls are soft and damp, rotten. If you applied even the least pressure, your fingers would sink deep into the spongy wood. Inside the old wreck, in a corner, a pair of vulcanized rubber boots. Look inside. They are filled almost to the top with dark rainwater. Left here long ago, set aside by a farmer after a day's muddy work. Never to set foot again in the old shed. He died sometime later of a crippling and lingering illness, a virtual prisoner in his small room, though his window provided an expansive view. Sometimes his eyes rested on the old shed, or he watched the sky, or gazed down the long lane and its grand avenue of trees. Today his fields are rented to a neighbor, his house, barn, and outbuildings, monuments to decay. I go into the farmhouse, close, humid, smelling of mold, but calm, eerily quiet, empty now for decades. His children grown, his wife long dead as well. I pass from one spoiled room to the next, rot, discard, and neglect reigning over all. Busted windows, peeling walls, broken sticks of furniture. Floors inches deep with rubble, smashed crockery, yellowed newspapers, fallen plaster. An overwhelming atmosphere of ruin and entropy. We will not visit the farmer's grim room. The stairs to the upper floor are in total collapse, a death trap for the curious. There is, however, another staircase. This one is fully intact, sturdy even. This one goes down, down. Stairs that end in inky blackness. Blackness that surprisingly turns out to be water, a flooded basement, deep as a swimming pool, strange and otherworldly. I step down into the black water. As I sink into it, it sinks into me. Within and without, the same. Cool, dark, still. Here in the bowels of the old house, I can hear the slow tick-tock of dissolution. Soon this place will be nothing but a tangle of planks in a damp hole, and then nothing at all. Now up through the floor, the stone walls, out again into the night. Down that avenue of trees, quick, quick, across another field, over a fence, and along a gravel road. Here I pause a moment, noticing a tremendous chorus of cricket voices, wave upon wave of sound. How had I not heard them until now? It is as if I had not noticed, until this instant, that I had previously been deaf. I am also suddenly aware of the intense beauty and loneliness of this prosaic Ontario landscape.
Thank you. So to me, that passage in particular really ties into the theme of this Words Fest this weekend, which is imagining Southwesto identities. So it's got a really strong Southwestern Ontario Gothic feel. And I know you're a fan of Alice Munro.
Yeah.
Which comes across clearly to me in this chapter. And Southwestern Ontario and Dominion in particular seem to be very much characters of the book alongside Abe and Simon. So can you talk about how growing up in the region has influenced and permeated your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like my work for a long time has been about the landscape, I suppose. I lived in Toronto for 20 years, and during those years, I think the work was really about Toronto. It was about the urban landscape. And then I moved to Guelph, and I've been in Guelph for about 19 years now. And I think a few years ago, somebody said to me, some interviewer asked me why my work was so much about the landscape, the Ontario landscape. And I thought to myself, oh, yeah, it's true. I'm drawing like the Ontario landscape all the time now. It's not about urban landscapes anymore. And I think it's just as simple as that, you know, the work reflects where you live. I mean, every artist, their work is about their environment. And for me, I grew up in small town Ontario, and probably that was important to grow up in small town Ontario. Those are very important formative memories. But when I left small town Ontario, there was nothing less I wanted to think about than small town Ontario. When I got to Toronto, I very quickly redefined myself as a Toronto person. I made up a new identity for myself, a new name. It was a chance to be someone else. And I did not think about small town Ontario much, except that, you know, things come out in the work whether you want it to or not. When I wrote that book about It's a Good Life If You Don't Weaken, much of it takes place in Toronto, but still, a lot of it takes place in a little town, Strathroy, Ontario, because that's where I spent formative years. And, you know, you just make these decisions without making them. I think now, at this point in my life, it's very conscious. I think about the Ontario landscape a lot. My wife and I, every weekend, drive somewhere. Guelph is a great city because you're right in the middle of everything. You drive to Woodstock, you drive to Stratford, Hamilton, London, whatever. Everything's close. And in that, you're driving through the countryside, and there's a term, eye candy. And I think it's a great term because it really does like make the understanding of there's a flavor in the eye. That when you look at things, you take pleasure. And driving around in the countryside, I always feel like a greedy like appetite of like how beautiful the shapes in Ontario are. You know, it's like, especially in between London and Toronto. I grew up closer to Windsor, much flatter there. You get up here, it's the rolling countryside. It's particularly gorgeous compositions everywhere you look. And in the world of cartooning, which really isn't about drawing, a lot of people think cartooning is about drawing, it's about designing. And so you look around and it's all about moving shapes around. And that landscape, it's shapes, beautiful shapes.
Now, talking about Strathroy,
Mm-hmm.
we're in London, so the home of the beloved London Free Press editorial cartoonist Merle Tingley.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand that Tingley paid a visit to your grade school class.
He did.
And that this had
Yeah.
a big effect on you.
Yeah, I think he visited when I was in kindergarten, actually, in Strathroy. And this was probably, certainly the first cartoonist I ever met, but it was also maybe he was definitely the first cartoonist I ever thought about. Because, of course, as Londoners all know, with little Luke Worm, the little worm that was always in his cartoons, that was like a perfect thing to interest you as a child. Obviously, I was not interested in jokes about Trudeau or Diefenbaker, but I was very interested in finding that worm in the cartoons. And I think that like, his visit, coming and showing that you could draw for a living, was like really influential in my thinking. Now, I didn't decide to become a cartoonist in kindergarten, but I think much later, I realized like there's something very powerful about things, the media, and then recognizing that people do it. Mm-hmm. And that was like an early understanding that you could do that.
Skip ahead. So, to bring things full circle, here's Merle Tingley's Ting, and then
Yep.
I've got a picture of you here, Seth, with Merle, where it was 6 or 7 years ago now, at the first Ting Festival, Seth inducted Tingley into the Cartoonist Hall of Fame for the Doug Wright Awards.
Yeah, no, that was a great event.
It was. Yeah. Seth gave a speech, which was lovely, and Ting and his family were there, and he had a great time. You can see on his face right there.
You don't get too many of those experiences in life where you get to circle around and return to an event like that, like where somebody came to your school when you were in kindergarten, and then later you're like, putting a medal on them. It's an interesting experience.
So I'm going to move on to your many, many non-comic book related projects. So here we are in Museum London. You've had a show here.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah. You've had a show at the AGO. You've curated a show with Art Spiegelman in Vancouver for comics. You were recently in the Museum London show, Words and Pictures, last year. Now, right now, whether people know it or not, Seth is featured in 3 gallery shows right now in Southwestern Ontario alone. So he's one of the 4 featured artists in the Art Gallery of Hamilton's This Is Serious show. That's right here in the upper left. The other there's over 100 cartoonists featured on this show right now, which goes till January 5th. The other featured artists are Chester Brown, Fiona Smith, and Julie Doucette.
Yep, curated by Joe Ullman.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now there's a full retrospective on at the Art Gallery of Guelph right now on Seth, which is fantastic, and I would encourage everybody to go. That's on until December 15th. Now the bottom one here is a whole marionette set that Seth has done out of paper mache. This is a sketchbook. This is not actually for printed publication. This is just for Seth's personal, for himself. One of his many sketchbooks that's on display right now in Guelph. And you have a solo show at Renan Isaacs right now in Guelph.
No, it's been a good time.
So I went to the opening for your Guelph show, and I consider myself fairly knowledgeable about your work, and I went with a couple of other cartoonists, and I don't know if they're here, but the whole time I was thinking, oh my God, and he does this too? This is a ceramics piece, he's collaborating with artists, this is a fantastic, fantastic piece, and part of it is where do you find the time, and part of it is often artists hit a certain moment, and then I feel people enjoy that style of their work, and they replicate that work over and over. You were doing completely new things, and you're just getting better.
Thank you, that's very nice.
It's a bit frustrating for the rest of us.
Well, you know, I think that it's interesting. I mean, when I was younger, I just wanted to be a cartoonist. It was pretty straightforward. When I was a teenager, I wanted to draw like Marvel Comics. And then in my 20s, when I went to art school, I feel like my world was opened up for me, that there was a bigger world of art than I knew. But even then, I feel like, and I've often said this, that I'd been tricked into being a cartoonist because as a teenager, I spent so much time drawing those superhero comic books that it really was the only kind of art I knew how to do. So, but cartooning, it was a great moment to become a cartoonist because the field was opening up into a new world. And I think that held my focus really strongly for like 20 years. 20 years of being intensely interested in cartooning, the form itself, and in its history. One of the things that was interesting about cartooning is that unlike many other art forms, you couldn't just go to the museum or to the library and find out its history. It was buried in, you know, stacks of old newsprint. So one of the things that my generation of cartoonists and the ones before me really had to do was that you had to be a collector as well. You had to go out and find the primary work, and that meant, you know, digging into piles of old newsprint, old books, microfiche. I mean, I probably spent 30 years digging through the history of comics too, and what was interesting about that was that's the period where the canon of who the good cartoonists of the past was built. And that canon is always determined by the people of the future, people who look back and make these decisions. And my generation had a lot to do with deciding like who were the good artists of the past. So it had a lot to do with our particular interests. The generation just before us who'd been digging back, they had a different canon. It's like you'd see things like Flash Gordon. Flash Gordon was not in our canon because we weren't interested in fantasy. So much of it was about real experience. That's why suddenly things like Gasoline Alley have been, you know, been reprinted. But that was like 30 or 40 years of being a cartoonist. And I must say that at a certain point, I felt myself drifting into other fields of interest. And I think that that's just a natural part of what I call the studio process, which is in the studio, you have a different, studio work isn't the same as published work. It's like it can be. You work in the studio, you make work, and you publish it. But much of what the studio is about is exploration. That's where being a visual artist is maybe different than being a writer, is that you do a lot of stuff and it may not have any specific purpose. So I work in a lot of sketchbooks, I do a lot of paper cutouts, I make things, whatever. This is a process that I consider is still connected to my whole childhood experience of making things. So as a kid, I liked to make models. I used to cut things out of cardboard and glue them together. I liked to paint things. You know, that whole experience that was just play is still a big part of my studio process. But I guess as I've gotten older, that work has taken on actual forms of its own. So there are now sculptural works. But they all follow what I call like the studio life because they're meant for me. Maybe they turn into work that I show. Like the City of Dominion, which is a city of model buildings, was not meant originally to be displayed. It was just meant to be made. And it actually was a curator, Ben Portis, who was from London, who came and saw them in my house and then said we should put these on display. And that sort of changed my thinking about them. Then I was like, oh, well, maybe these are something for display. And much of the work is that kind of category. I make it for myself first, and then if it feels like it has a life outside the studio, then that's good.
I'm going to read a great quote you have about cartooning and art. You say, cartooning is a hard game. You have to make your own rules to survive. Figure out ways to make a living. Compromises are often made, but you must be sure they're minor compromises. Never compromise on the big thing, your real work. So I think that's very true.
It is true. No, this is the thing I try to tell young cartoonists, because cartooning is like a funny form, because like I said, it comes out of a commercial background. I mean, that's the origin of cartooning, is that it was for publication, and it was mostly just a commercial medium, you know. Even the great stuff that was done in old comics was generally done by accident. That's not, maybe not by accident, but let's say it wasn't the intention of the people who were publishing it that they produced great work. The artists made great work by accident. They did what they wanted to do, and they managed to get it through. So something like Peanuts, which I think is a great work of art, 50 years of like a really individual vision. Nobody at United Features said, Charles Schulz, we would like you to do 50 years of an individual vision. They said, we want something we can sell. Is it funny? You know, blah, blah, blah. Schulz, being a rare individual, produced a unique piece of work. But most of the comics on the funnies page were just there to be funny, and that's all they were. So it's, so coming from that background, the natural thing when children or teens or even people in their early 20s start doing cartooning is they start thinking about it in terms of sales and like, can I get a publisher? Is this marketable? You know, even now in the era of graphic novels, one of the big things is like, is this like, that people are looking for something that's like kind of catchy. Maybe I can do a book about, you know,
Zombies.
Zombies, or how I got, you know, what I was sick last year. Maybe this will tap into some sort of self-help market, or you know, they're still thinking in terms of a hook. And I try to say, like, don't think that way. It's like you got to think like an artist, which is, it's about the work. Artists have always had the problem of how do you make a living. It should be no different for cartoonists, and it is no different. You shouldn't be thinking about like the money as that path. You have to think about the work first, and then worry later about the other side effects. And that doesn't mean that great selling books are bad books. Obviously not. I mean, we were just talking earlier about Raina. What's her last name again?
Raina Telgemeier.
Yeah, I've never said it aloud. But she's like, I've not read her work, but from what everyone tells me, it's like her books are wildly successful, but they're also really good, and that they became wildly successful because they were good. Not because she said, I need to make some very successful young adult novels. And I think that that is the thing. You can be very successful, but what you got to keep true to is trying to be an artist.
Yes. And on that, I'm going to show one other slide, and then we'll take a couple questions from the audience. So I wanted to finish with this. This is the third of Seth's gallery shows right now. This is his show is called, what's the name?
It's called Night Drive.
So these are large gouache and India ink paintings. And I think this goes totally with what we were saying about the beauty of southwestern Ontario landscapes. I mean, all of these are very familiar sights to me. And then you've really boiled them down and simplified them.
Yeah.
But I feel like I've seen all of these many times over. And
yeah, they're all in Ontario.
Yeah,
I mean,
you see them so many times, you kind of forget how gorgeous they are.
Yeah, no, I love that Ontario landscape. It really is very beautiful, and I think that increasingly, like the landscape is, of course, becoming more homogeneous, you know, and as more and more stuff gets built. But the interesting thing about landscape, urban landscape or rural landscape, is it's accidental, how things come together, even all the stuff we've built. I think when I was in my 20s, and I'm a very old-fashioned Mr. Old-Timey guy, that I would have put a good argument on that the world was ugly, the urban landscape, and that it would be so much more beautiful if we had kept things to the 1930s kind of aesthetic, and you know, and I really would have liked to live in a perfect Art Deco city. But now I recognize that's a museum. We don't live in a museum. The exciting thing about the man-made landscape and its interaction with the real landscape is that it's not planned. And so you get the very interesting juxtaposition of things with each other. It's like maybe a dollar store isn't a beautiful thing, and maybe it would be nicer if it was a temple to beautiful design, but the way landscape and cityscape evolves is interesting and beautiful.
Thank you. So do we have any questions from the audience?
Great.
Charles.
Oh, yeah, about like for hand lettering?
Yes.
Yeah, when I was younger, I decided to do upper and lower case because I think, I can't remember the thought process anymore, but I decided to use it in Clyde Fans back then because I was doing all my stuff in upper and lower case. And then about halfway through Clyde Fans, I stopped using it in my other work. But I had to keep it for Clyde Fans for consistency, so I had to keep doing that terrible upper and lower case lettering right through to the end. It was a bad decision. I think I wanted it to be different than Spider-Man lettering. But the truth is there's a reason why comics lettering is all uppercase. And it reads better, and it sits better in the balloons because you don't have any descenders. Those descenders screw up everything. They don't work well in hand lettering. And I would suggest any young cartoonist to do it in uppercase. Yeah.
Yes.
So cartoonists in making stuff often have to kind of pull from memory and draw things from your mind.
Mm-hmm.
But because your stories are often based in more real life and less fantasy, I'm wondering like what percentage of it is reference? Like how much do you have to go out and take shots with your camera versus just kind of pulling from your own brain?
Yeah, well, I use a lot of reference. I mean, I don't use reference in any way for like to capture reality, though, obviously. I don't think cartooning is about reality or drawing things in the real world. I think cartooning is about a series of symbols. The drawings are symbols, and that's not much different than the way words are symbols. I mean, letters are symbols, and you put them together, and then you read them, and you read R-E-D, and you say red, and then you see red in your brain. And when you draw things on the comics page, it's the same thing. You may draw a picture of a house, an iconic sort of image of a house, and people fill in the reality in their own brains. Like I can draw a dirty sink in a kind of simplified way, but I can't really draw the reality of the rust around the faucets or none of that. I can only suggest these things. And so memory is the right term to use, like you said, drawing from memory, because I think most drawing in comics is what I would call memory drawings. You may even be looking at an actual picture to say like, oh, I need to draw a street scene, so I'll flip open a book to a picture of a street scene, and then you kind of copy or adapt it. But that's still kind of like what you're actually doing is using like kind of the idea of an iconic image of a street that you're kind of playing with always. I think of memory as an interesting thing because memory isn't really a photographic process. Memory is a strange process that involves images, but I feel like if I was to think about like kindergarten, I would think, okay, well, there's my desk, and I'm sitting in my desk, and then there's a blackboard over here, and then you start to build a scene kind of out of it. You reach around and find the elements of memory. You may have some memories that are purely photographic, but a lot of it, I think, is kind of iconographic and map-oriented. And I think cartooning relates a lot to that. You're designing things to make people think about things, to make them feel experiences, and the way you draw is actually, I think, I've always said comics isn't like film and it isn't like prose. It's a bit like poetry and graphic design put together. Because poetry is all about condensing language, making language simple, choosing it right, how you operate within a certain structure, which is the page, which is a lot like meter. And design, because you're really designing the page to make people do things, to look at things, to follow things in a certain way. It's like you can make comics where every panel is a beautiful, painted, realistic scene. I don't usually like those comics, though, because they slow things down. It's like they used to make comics with photographs, and there's a reason why that has never been popular, is that it's awkward. Somehow, when you take photographs and put word balloons on them, they might be good for a meme, but they don't work very well for telling a story. Something's wrong with it. It's too real.
This is maybe a good example too. Here is if you want to describe just briefly, Seth, I think you used Google Street View.
Yeah, these are all drawn from Google Street View. I mean, I talk about driving around and how much I love the countryside, and I hate technology. But probably the greatest invention of the 21st century is Google Street View. When you think about it, they're out there mapping the whole world. And it's totally interesting. You can you can drive around on your computer, go all up streets, up down here. It's really interesting. And they've been doing it for enough years now that you can click back 10 years. Just think if this carries on for children in like 30 or 40 years, they'll be able to go back to their neighborhood and say, like, here's my house, here is where I walk to school, there's the corner store. They'll be able to see everything in a way, I mean, that's my dream. I wish I could do that. But it's a totally great way to, like, I was sitting in my studio and I'm like, I'm going to draw, like, the Ontario landscape from Google Street View. It's great. You can adjust the angle, move it around. The only thing that's totally a lie is every street view is in the middle of the day. These are all set at night.
Yeah, I was wondering about that.
So it's fake. Yeah.
So we have time for one last question. Gentleman in the red here.
Thank you. It's just a pleasure to hear you speak.
Oh, thank you.
And I just wanted to get your opinion. When I go to a bookstore, or
Mm-hmm.
when I'm exposed to
Yeah,
Most of it is, as you say, superheroes and things like
Yeah.
that, but also there are horror things that you can display in graphic novel.
Mhm.
You wouldn't get away with writing.
Oh, for sure.
Talking about.
Yeah.
Or sexual things that you wouldn't find in Playboy if they're like really
Oh, yeah,
graphic.
yeah, for sure.
For sure. And when you go to the store and you look in the graphic novel section,
Mhm.
mostly it's that stuff. It's either superheroes or vampires or
Absolutely.
horrible things.
Yeah.
And I've never come across really
Yeah.
cartoonists. Like I read online to go read this book. I think it was called My Mother's Daughter. I'm
Yeah.
My Mother's Daughter. And it was a graphic novel.
Okay.
And it was it was life. Right?
Okay,
Like
yeah.
what you're doing, but
I don't think I know it, but carry on.
more graphic.
Okay, sure.
And it wasn't, are you my mother? That was
Oh.
what it was called.
I might know it, I don't know.
Yeah, but it's not what, like you're talking about,
Yeah.
emotional.
I think I know where you're
it's
going.
like reading
Yeah.
the salesman when you talk about this.
Yeah.
Salespeople.
Yeah.
And I didn't know there was that much cartooning on
Sure.
it that was so real. And also, I just wanted to say that sometimes in children, they won't read a book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you put a graphic novel in their hand, all of a sudden they start reading.
You
No, it's
are
true.
really right.
It's true. We've reached the point now where the culture is so debased that comics are looking good.
And
But the funny thing is, though, I mean, I know exactly what you're talking about, and this would be my complaint about cartooning in general, is that it's still a commercial art form. And that most, of course, I mean, the funny thing is, when I was a kid, like, superheroes were like something just for kids, and nobody else knew who they were. And if I said to my dad, could you draw me a picture of Iron Man? He would have said, who? Now, of course, there's no dad in the world who doesn't know who Iron Man is. Everybody knows who Iron Man is. Everybody knows who every superhero is. What's strange is that that culture of childhood succeeded wildly. But that brings me no pleasure. I wanted cartooning to succeed, not the genres. So the genres of cartooning are still very, very popular. So and more popular than ever in a way. Superheroes, monsters, all this stuff, and that's fine. It all has its place. I have no problem with that. I loved that as a kid. But the world of cartooning that I'm interested in is the world of real life, or not real life. That's too narrow. Just to say, like, using the art form for more adult or complicated reasons. And there is a lot of that work out there, but you have to work at it to find it. And that's the thing.
I think
Yeah.
Josh wants us to finish up. But
Okay.
in terms of the library comment, we've got some librarians in the audience. And
Yeah.
I have to say that librarians are the ones who have championed the
Yeah,
art
they
form.
have.
And I think they're really part of what has brought the popularity of the art form back. So
That's true.
whatever we can do to get kids reading, let's do it.
Yeah.
And graphic novels are one of the only growth industries in the book industry now. So
That and children's books.
that and children's
Because people
books.
still want their children to read, so they give them children's books. And that's an interesting point, is that people still feel reading a book is valuable for their child. So
Which it is.
that feels good to me.
Which is a great note to end on, I think.
Yeah.
So what we're going to do is there's going to be a table outside that they're going to set Seth up at if you have books or anything for him to sign. I know upstairs the Western bookstore has a great selection of Seth's books available if you wanted to go up and pick it up, and he'll sign just outside. So thank you very much.